Hello, and welcome to the lecture portion of Module 4 on addiction. This is the first in a two-part lecture for this module. We'll be talking about the biopsychosocial model of addiction, as well as understanding addiction as a disorder in the DSM. This first part will focus on the biopsychosocial model, and then the second part will focus on the DSM. So, for our purposes, we'll be defining addiction as the repeated compulsive use of a substance despite negative consequences. So, it's using substances based on a compulsion, an urge, a drive repeatedly, even in the face of some unintended negative effects. This is also a way to define psychological dependence. It's a phenomenon that falls into the category of as the sort of way we think or the way we behave or the way we feel. It is not the same as physical dependence. So, for example, you can have physical dependence on a substance without a psychological dependence or addiction. For example, decongestants. So, if you take Sudafed, your body adapts to the use of that substance. You can develop a tolerance to it, which is the same as dependence, so that when you stop taking decongestants, you actually start to experience more, feeling more stuffed up, right? So decongestants, you can develop a physical dependence on them but no one is compulsively using decongestants despite negative consequences. So there isn't a psychological component to decongestants. The strongest addictions, though, tend to have both. So having a drug or a substance that causes a physical dependence within the body, as well as a compulsion to use the drug despite negative consequences, having both of those factors present really creates a very powerful addiction. So, from a biopsychosocial standpoint, we're going to first start with the bio, and the basis of addiction really comes down to dopamine and the experience of pleasure in the brain. So, in the typical experiences of pleasure, dopamine is involved. It's the neurotransmitter that is released when we engage in a pleasurable activity, and it's what allows us to experience that as pleasurable or as rewarding. So, for example, eating like some delicious food or engaging in an activity that you enjoy, looking forward to a special trip or a birthday or seeing someone who you really enjoy spending time with. All of these things are pleasurable and they're associated with the release of dopamine in the brain. And it because of that pleasurable experience, the release of dopamine reinforces the behavior. And so reinforce means that it increases the behavior. We tend to seek out things that are pleasurable. And that happens because of the way dopamine acts within the reward pathway of the brain, also called a pleasure circuit. So dopamine is released in the midbrain, and it is sent to 4 different areas of the rest of the brain. It goes to the amygdala, which is an area of the brain associated with emotion. That process allows us to feel good and to feel happy, to feel pleasure. It's also released to the nucleus accumbens, which controls movement. So it's something that it's sort of energizing in terms of seeking out that experience. It's released to the frontal lobe where our attention and planning and decision making is located. So from there, we decide, hey, that was great. I will have some more of that. And dopamine is also released to the hippocampus, our area of the brain associated with memory, so that we remember Oh, I felt good that one time that I rode my bike down the beach pathway. Maybe I'll go do that again. Um, and so this release of dopamine through this reward pathway really impacts our motivation to engage in particular behaviors. So essentially, the more pleasurable the behavior, the more this pathway is activated and the more motivated we are to engage in that behavior again. And this is in very typical, normal functioning, healthy functioning, adaptive functioning. Now, what drugs do is they kind of hijack that reward pathway. So, not all substances do this to the same degree. There are some drugs that are better hijackers of that pathway than others. But in most cases, those drugs are substituting for the natural reinforcement that we experience in our environment and from activities that we enjoy in our environment. Um, so people who use drugs then are um, in, they're using a substance that releases this pleasurable experience in the brain, and that can be very reinforcing, very motivating, and those individuals can then seek out the pleasure of using that drug, and so that drug then becomes somewhat of an addictive drug. Another component to addiction, though, is also wanting to avoid the pain of not using the drug. So, yes, using the drug, release of pleasure, activates the reward systems. That feels good. I'm going to do it again. Definitely a component of addiction. However, as we learned before, our body then adapts and responds to that chronic use of a drug. And then when the drug is stopped, those adaptations harm us and we start to feel bad. And so that dependence and tolerance on the drug creates withdrawal symptoms. And so some people are at least equally, if not more, motivated to continue using a drug to avoid withdrawal symptoms than they are actually because they want to experience the positive feeling that they experience with drugs. And so I posed to you a question about what your thoughts are about this. So this is the lecture question for Module 4. Um, does that make sense to you? Is that something that you have sort of witnessed or you've noticed in film and media, the way that drug addiction is portrayed? And do you believe it that avoiding the unpleasant feelings can be more of a motivator, if not at least an equal motivator as seeking the pleasure itself of using the drug? So, as I mentioned a moment ago, drugs hijack that neural pathway, that reward pathway in the brain, and it essentially just supercharges the release of dopamine into all of that circuitry, starting with the nucleus accumbens. And the amount of dopamine released by drugs, for example, like heroin or cocaine, far outweighs the amount of dopamine that's released by any sort of typical life experience. So the drug is like a direct hit and a massive influx of dopamine to the brain. Um, and so it creates this sensation in the brain that just can't be replicated by any other means. So it really is this kind of singular experience for the user. And so, because of that, it's very, very, very rewarding and very, very, very motivating to continue using. And additionally, um, there's an factor that keeps people using drugs is that um, the first time a drug is used, the amount of dopamine that's released will be higher than it will ever be with the use of that drug. So at the first time a person uses a drug, more dopamine is released than will ever be released again. And that hooks someone, quite literally, to constantly be chasing that first high and that first pleasurable experience. But because of the nature of the way dopamine works and the way drugs work in our brain, it can't be replicated. And so the person continues to use the drug. So it becomes this chronic habit. And again, the body adapts and tolerances develop so that it takes more and more of the drug to get the same high, the same pleasurable feeling. So the body adapts in two ways. That reduces the production of the neurotransmitter dopamine because it's like, hey, I'm getting all this dopamine coming in from this drug. I don't need to make as much of my own, and it reduces the receptor sites that bind to dopamine because it's saying, whoa, whoa, this is a lot of dopamine. I don't need all of these receptors to catch it all. I've got plenty. And so, with those biological changes, um, the uh, user also then has to increase the amount of drugs used to experience any high or any pleasurable feeling at all. And so eventually it becomes the case that just using an incredibly high amount of the drug is necessary just to get to baseline functioning for the individual because of the way the bodies adapt. So, because of that impact on the dopamine system, that's what leads a user to continually chase that first experience that they will never get because of the way the body adapts and responds to chronic drug use. And so, because of that, the way that the body adapts and responds to drug use and the development of tolerance and the experience of withdrawal, um, it's sometimes drug users who are wanting to stop using drugs are given small amounts of the drug in order to reduce the cravings that they're experiencing, but they're not given an amount that recreates that high or the pleasurable sensation. And the idea here is that it allows time for the brain to adapt back to homeostasis or a state of being before drug use. So, for example, the nicotine patch is a way of helping someone quit smoking cigarettes. And it's providing nicotine to the cigarette smoker at a level that is meant to reduce cravings, but doesn't give the same nicotine high that the user would experience if they were smoking a cigarette. And the way the patch is used, or any kind of nicotine replacement, gum or lozenges, um, is the amount of nicotine that's given reduces over time so that the user eventually gets to a place where they are no longer dependent on nicotine. They have no more nicotine coming into the body, and their body has adapted so that they don't need nicotine to kind of function at baseline. This is another strategy that's used in the treatment of opioid addiction. Methadone and buprenorphine are both ways to stimulate the opioid receptor sites, reduce the cravings for heroin and other opioids, but doesn't create the same high that heroin users experience. Um, there isn't anything that works for stimulants like cocaine yet. So it may be that we develop a drug that does this as well. All of these drugs would be considered agonists for the receptor sites. So they activate the same receptor sites as the original drug, but they're just do it to a degree that's less intense than the original drug. And so the there's debate about the use of um, these sorts of drug replacement programs in order to help someone quit using a different drug. Is it just swapping one addiction for another? Is this a way of just maintaining the original addiction because the substance is the same? You're giving the user a different the substance is different, but you're giving the user the same or a slightly less intense version of the original drug that they're trying to run from. And so that's actually, I made a mistake before. So this is to see if you're paying attention. Uh, Not really. This is just a mistake on my part. But this is actually the lecture question that I intended to use for Module 4. So you can disregard the previous question, although it's still interesting to consider. But the question I'd like you to answer for the lecture questions for Module 4 is, what are your thoughts about nicotine replacement or methadone and buprenorphine for opioid addiction? Using drugs to stop drug use, is this just swapping one addiction for another? Is this just maintaining the original addiction? Or is this a way for helping someone quit while giving the body time to adjust? So I'm posing that to you as the lecture question for Module 4. Once a user has engaged in chronic drug use and abuse, the question becomes, how long do those effects last in the body? And it can be framed as this kind of cucumber or pickle debate. So essentially, are you forever altered by your drug use? Do you go from a cucumber to a pickle? You can't unpickle a pickle. So can you unpickle a human drug user? Um, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous are both founded on the principle that you cannot go back to who you were before you used drugs, that you are forever changed by the experience of being an addict to drugs. When you go to AA or NA meetings, when people introduce themselves, even if they've been 20 years sober, they say, "My name is so and so, and I'm an addict," or "My name is so and so, and I'm an alcoholic." Um, because the idea is that from their perspective, once an addict, always an addict, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic, if you're using or not. From a biological perspective, there's debate here. So there's some evidence that things can get back to normal over time. There are certain receptors that, in the presence of massive amounts of drug use, the receptor sites are depleted and they are shrunk because the body's adapting. And then after drug use stops, over time, the receptors return to normal. But there are other impacts that may be far longer lasting, particularly in the way we metabolize different substances in the body. But I think most importantly, like, even if we can recover biologically from chronic drug use, there are psychological factors that um, make it harder to sort of return to a pre-drug use state. When someone's in the depths of addiction or they're really struggling with chronic drug use and abuse, their socio and emotional development really takes a back seat. It The focus of their life tends to become drug-seeking behavior, using drugs, and their own emotional development, their relationships with other people. Um, all of those things take a hit psychologically, and it's harder to um, reverse those effects in the brain. And that's, I don't like this analogy, this cucumber pickle analogy, very much, because I think it's pretty stigmatizing. So you'll see this debate out in the world, but I would caution against really thinking about people who use substances as damaged goods. Because while using drugs might change who you are, or change your biology, or change your psychology, um, it doesn't it isn't the only thing that defines a person. And so once that person recovers from addiction, they may be a very different person than they would have been if they had never used. But that doesn't mean that they're a bad person, because they could experience growth and change in a different way on the other side of drug use. So, um, drugs are impactful both physically and psychologically, um, but they don't necessarily cause irreversible damage, um, if someone can find the pathway to recovery and get the help that they need. So that we just talked about this sort of biological and more psychological models of addiction and understanding addiction. Another psychological component to addiction is classical conditioning. So just the Pavlovian straight up like associate a stimulus with a response, and you'll start to be able to condition that response. So just as a review, you begin with a neutral stimulus, something that doesn't cause any kind of reaction in the human or the subject. So just ringing a bell doesn't have any kind of reaction on the part of the dog. Um, but then you also have an unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus that you know causes a particular reflex or reaction in the dog. So in this case, food causes salivation. And then when learning happens, that conditioned stimulus, the neutral stimulus, is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, the thing that causes the reflex, over and over and over again, so much that the uh, organism starts to exhibit the reflex in response to the formerly neutral signal or the conditioned stimulus. So the bell all of a sudden starts to cause salivating without the experience of food. And so this relates to drug use, in that there are certain stimuli, sensations, and perceptions associated with drug use that start to trigger dopamine release in the brain through classical conditioning. So, um, something like a syringe or the particular chair that a person sits in to use drugs, a person that the person does drugs with, a sweater that they wear when they do drugs. So these things, because they're associated with drug use, become a new trigger for the release of dopamine in the brain, and this then causes cravings. So without the drug present, just seeing the person that they used to do drugs with triggers the release of dopamine and is reactivates a desire and a motivation to engage in drug use. Um, Whether or not that person decides to act on that craving can be a matter of willpower, or using strategies or tips or tricks to try to ride the wave of craving until it subsides. But the fact that a craving has occurred is a biological process. It's rooted in this dopamine reward pathway, and the the way that the craving developed, um, might be rooted in the brain, but it also occurred because of learning, a psychological experience of pairing the drug with um, a certain stimuli or a certain experience. There are other factors, individual factors to consider. So this is the biopsychosocial, and then there's also social factors to consider in terms of the development of addiction. There is actually quite a lot of evidence that genetics play a component to our susceptibility to addiction. So children whose parents were addicts are more likely to become addicted to drugs. Identical twins are more likely than fraternal twins to share the same level of risk or to be drug users. And also, children who are adopted tend to have more similar risk to their biological parents than they do to their adopted parents. Um, That being said, biology is not destiny. So just because someone has a genetic predisposition to substance abuse doesn't mean that they'll actually engage in substance use. Um, there are a lot of factors that other factors consider, uh, including environment, that's major. There's controversy around whether or not there's such a thing as an addictive personality, but we can say that there are individual differences in terms of the degree to which someone seeks out new sensations or the level of risk that they're willing to tolerate in their life, that these things might be correlated with drug use and addiction. um, Environment or life experiences. So having a substance using parent, one, imparts probably some genetic components and predisposition to using drugs, but also just the social experience of watching a parent or someone important in your life, caregiver, using drugs, can predispose a child to grow up to use drugs as well. It's sort of a learned thing. Um, the experience of physical or emotional abuse can predispose someone to seek out drugs. We'll talk about that a bit more with mental illness, but as a sort of trauma response, trying to avoid um, the psychological fallout from that trauma might drive someone to use drugs. Or being conditioned by drug using peers. So that, you know, someone, drug use can be trendy, right? And it can be something that a user engages in to get along with peers or sort of have more of a connection to their friends group if that's what their friends are doing. And then also just the individual experience of mental illness. So it's unclear whether or not which came first, right? It's sort of a chicken and the egg thing. There is a link between mental illness and substance use, but the question of which comes first is still debatable. So in some cases, someone who's experiencing mental illness may seek out drugs as a way to self-medicate. And in the example of PTSD from physical or emotional abuse is a good example of that. Also, veterans who experience PTSD, there's a lot of alcoholism among veterans with PTSD because alcohol is a way to kind of shut down the experience of trauma. Um, and but then also, uh, it is also possible that using drugs and chronic drug use can then cause mental illness. So, or at least mimic the symptoms of mental illness. So, that it really depends on the individual and their unique experience there. The bottom line, and this is according to the textbook or the book that you're reading, is that anyone with a brain can become addicted to drugs. So there is a biological system in the brain, a reward pathway that is primed to respond to chronic substance use uh, in a way that promotes and motivates the individual to continue using drugs and therefore to become addicted to them. However, most people don't become addicted to drugs. And what we do know for sure, though, is that if you don't ever use drugs, there's no chance to get addicted. So that the safest way to avoid addiction is to not use drugs at all. Um, but if someone uses drugs and they're otherwise mentally healthy, they come from a stable family, they've got a good work life, there's no family history of drug use, that does decrease the chances that that individual will become addicted to drugs, but it doesn't mean that there's no chance. So there is still some risk of becoming addicted to drugs anytime someone uses drugs. Um, and that risk varies per individual. So even with all those environmental factors at play, drug use is just more fun and more pleasurable for some people than it is for others. So you can have the case where someone really enjoys the sensation of having a glass of wine, whereas another person feels like it just gives them a headache and kind of makes them nauseous. And so one of those people is more likely to become an alcoholic than the other. And furthermore, access matters. So, someone who is around an environment where drugs are readily available is going to be more predisposed to using drugs or becoming an addict than someone who really doesn't even know how to get drugs or doesn't see them in their day-to-day life. So that's it for part one. And the second lecture will continue momentarily.